need to break stories. We need to break stories about the necessity of fossil fuel and our dependence on it. We need to break stories about so many things that people will tell you are impossible that in fact are quite possible. And we need to have the stories about them possible coming to pass over and over, whether it's the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the sort of totalitarian sort of pseudo, communism, the triumph of same-sex marriage rights nationally and in a lot of other parts of the world, which was another thing that seemed impossible not long before. We need to be story makers and story breakers, and we need to understand how much it's about telling and compelling stories and inviting stories and stories that speak to everyone, not just to people who have exactly the same toolkits we do, but who might have different sets of assumptions. We need stories that invite people in, stories that invite people to come together, stories that that convey hope. So and so much of that is around climate and climate change, where things have changed so dramatically and so rapidly in three ways that are all interwoven, that when I go back to something like back to 14 years ago, 2003, it's staggering how different everything was. There's a wonderful book that's a history of coal called Coal, A Human History, written by the former Attorney General of Minnesota, who wanted to deal with some of the climate issues as they started to look into coal, and felt like we needed, write a whole history about its emergence as a major fuel, its problems, etc. It was shocking to me looking at that book, which must have been written a little before it was published in 2003. It's a reminder of how far we've come. In 2003, there is no meaningful, powerful, effective climate movement. There is now, and most of the power has been built only in the last decade, a lot by college students, including the 7 college students who, with Bill McKibben, developed 350.org, starting in 2007, with an organization that's done actions in most countries in the world and has presence on most of the continent, every continent but Antarctica, and so there wasn't much of a climate movement. There was a sense that climate change was this slow-moving thing that was really about our grandchildren, problems for our grandchildren, which was always weird for people like me. I have great nephews and nieces already, but the whole grandchildren framework, and that assumed you were sort of middle-aged and reproductive, but the shocking thing about this book about coal is that it talked about what were the alternative to fossil fuels, and that reminded me that there were not good solutions in 2003. One of the banners in the Great Climate March in 2014 said, in New York City, the one with 400,000 people and sister marches all over the world, said, "We have the solutions." We didn't have them in 2003. There's been an energy revolution that has made it possible, as the great science consortium at Stanford has demonstrated, for nearly every country in the earth to go completely off fossil fuels to renewables. We could do it. The obstacles are not technological. Wind and solar and related technologies have become so extraordinarily effective, have transformed so much in becoming infinitely cheaper, far more widespread, often now in many parts of the world, including here and cheap in the United States, cheaper than fossil fuel. So the only obstacles are political, economic, social, the tremendous lock that the fossil fuel industry has on political power. And that's part of the good news. There's a story to tell there about if we shift from fossil fuel, we break the power that companies like Exxon, which has given us our new Secretary of State, who seems, and who I think may not fully comprehend that after having worked for Exxon for his whole life, that's no longer who he works for. Or maybe he intends to continue working for Exxon. Certainly the collaborations between Exxon and Vladimir Putin And a lot of Russia's political agenda are about that. Putin sees the future of Russia as being in fossil fuel, and therefore that's part of his was part of his interest in a Trump presidency as a kind of anti-climate change policy regime, a kind of loosening as a kind of backward journey. So that's one. So I think we need to tell a story. So there's hopeful stories about climate change. That's partly we've come so far. When you look at all the stuff Trump wants to roll back, part of what it reminds you is how far forward we've rolled, and we've done extraordinary things. There's a way leftists often tell stories about we need to start a movement today and do good things because we haven't done anything yet. And that's one of the ways leftists, of whom I am like a really annoying dissident member, are really depressing. And I'm here to say that actually we need to scale it up and become more powerful and effective, but it is here. The climate change toolkit is fantastic. It's achieving great things. A lot of brilliant people think the transition to fossil fuel is inevitable. The only question is if we'll destroy as much as possible by burning as much fossil fuel as possible, or destroy as little as possible by keeping it in the ground, and as little as possible, what kind of a transition we're going to make, whether we do it consciously, willingly, and constructively, or kind of fall into it after we've raised the temperature of the planet in ways that will make parts of, that will punish people in the equatorial world and the polar realms, the poor, and the other kinds of vulnerable people most. So we're in this extraordinary moment, and that's profoundly transformative. It has work for all of us to do. What's really, and I think, stopping and looking in the toolkit, seeing what grounds are there for hope, what kinds of stories are we carrying, who are we in disasters, what kinds of stories has the climate movement given us that are actually encouraging, that are actually hopeful, that actually tell us how much we could decentralize power as energy in ways that decentralize power as political force. And this could be a great democratizing movement. So we have all these things, and this is the toolkit that I wanted to unpack for you. And to remind you, not that you need to go out and get those things, but you may have them already. Together we have them. And with them, extraordinary things are possible, and that we can do together as a sort of recharged civil society, as a disaster community, as people embracing the public loves, as storytellers and breakers of stories, as people overcoming the tyranny of the quantifiable, to describe, represent, praise, valuable, all those subtle, ineffable things that make life worth living, that make it complex, it's poetic, it's beautiful, it's meaningful, it's sensual, it's hopeful, and it's deeply weird and interesting possibilities. So I'm really here to tell you that you have all this stuff already, and you do have nothing to thank me for, because there you are.